The Summer I Met David, Part 5, by the lovely Freya. Cold worry knotted in my chest. My fingertips drummed on my legs nervously as I looked up to Jack. His eyes were wide. All the colour had leaked out of his face. I recognised fear when I saw it. I felt as though I'd been punched squarely in the gut. If Jack was afraid, then I should be afraid. Another desperate, panicked shriek cut through the air. My mind crawled into dark places. A small voice in the back of my head asked if Johnny's bed was surrounded by snakes, if David's serpent-like tongue flicked at the air just inches away from him, if David was singing fucked up versions of nursery rhymes to him, just as he had to Joey and I. Jack's hand trembled as they tightened around me. The terror was practically radiating off him. My mouth gaped. My eyes were wide and filled with tears that streamed down my cheeks. I pleaded with God to save my brothers, to do something, anything at all, so that they wouldn't die in their rooms. I don't know if it was the prayer, or if Jack had simply come back to his senses. Either way, hot anger rolled through his eyes. I'd only ever seen him truly angry one time prior. It had been early last summer. Jim and Johnny had been out in the backfield playing. Dad had been in the barn with the pigs, and Mom had been at the church group with Joey. Jack had come back inside just long enough to grab something to drink, when the desperate and terrified screams of my brothers tore through the silence. He'd shouted at me to stay inside, and had darted through the front door. I watched and listened through the open kitchen window. Johnny and Jim were screaming about a coyote that foamed at the mouth, wobbled, and chased them. They pointed behind them to the barn, declaring that it was just on the other side. I'd watched as Jack stomped back into the home, anger rolling off him. He pushed open the door and stormed toward the stairs. He'd gone to the gun cabinet and left with a loaded rifle. Less than 10 minutes later, an ear-splitting bang sliced through the summer air. Jack returned, promising the boys that they were safe. Now, that same sort of anger oozed from him, and I knew, without a doubt, that Jack would do everything in his power to rid the world of the monster, the same way he had when he put down the coyote. He moved me over and pulled himself to his feet. The sound of my father's footsteps and desperate cries for Johnny to open the door nearly drowned out Jack's command. "I'm going to close the door. Do not open it under any circumstances," he instructed. I nodded in response and watched with ever-growing terror as my older brother, the man who had acted as my savior for these past several months, opened the door. He was stepping out into the unknown, abandoning the safety we'd found in his room. I peeked around him, out into the hallway. The table and the vase that had been sitting upon it had been tossed across the room, shiny green glass glistening atop the dark wood. My father stood before the door, barefoot, both socks soaked in blood as he banged against the door, desperately calling the names of his sons. Jack slammed the door closed. Suddenly, I was very alone. I don't know what happened in those moments that Jack was away, only that he never shouted any more Bible verses. The only voices that penetrated the heavy bedroom door were muffled and quiet. I couldn't make any of them out. I couldn't even tell who was speaking. Frustration washed over me, and I thought about crawling closer to the door and pressing an ear against the wood, but I was too frightened to move. The minutes ticked by. Finally, the door creaked open. My heart thrummed in response. I imagined David peeking around the corner, forked tongue flicking at the air. Instead, Jack stood in the hallway. He offered me a small, sad smile. "All clear, Chica," he informed me. I stayed firmly planted in my spot, looking past him to the hallway. The floor was smeared with blood, likely from the unprotected feet of my family members as they navigated the hall. Jack crouched down and opened his arms. "Come on, honey," he coaxed. "It's all okay. No more monsters," he swore. That sentence felt wrong to me. It sent a shiver down my spine. Jack was acknowledging the existence of monsters. And why shouldn't he? Wasn't that exactly what David was? A monster? For the life of me, I couldn't figure out why that word bothered me so much more than the word demon. Looking back now, I suspect it's because my family spent my entire life, up until that point, telling me that there was no such thing as monsters. We were a Christian family, which meant that demons was something I heard a lot about. That concept was easier to grasp. With my stomach still churning, I was quick to pull myself to my feet and run toward him. I practically threw myself at him. Muscular arms wrapped around me and pulled me up onto his shoulders. Slowly and carefully, he began the long trek downstairs. Twice he let out a small hiss of pain, cursed, and stopped to pull out a sharp piece of glass that had buried itself in his soft flesh. Both times I offered to walk, and both times Jack teasingly told me to shut my little mouth. Jack brought me into the living room, where he placed me safely upon the floor. Everyone, save for my father, was already gathered there. My mother held Joey in her arms. He sniffed pathetically, still softly hiccuping. A few stray tears streamed down his cheeks. Johnny was curled into a ball, sitting on the couch, rocking back and forth slowly. His eyes were haunted, and his features were stony. I remember thinking he looked more angry than frightened. Jim was curled into his own ball, but fast asleep on the couch. I nearly laughed. Mom always joked that Jim could sleep through anything. Jack placed me on the chair, his lips touched my forehead, and a massive hand swiped my curly hair back away from my face. "Listen, honey, I have to help Dad with some stuff. I'll be right back, okay?" he asked. I simply gave a nod and leaned back into the chair. "That's my brave little soldier. I'll put a movie on for you. You won't even notice that I'm gone." That was a lie. Jack was one of the very few people in the world that made me feel safe. He was the only one I could count on being there. Mom and Dad were so worried about Joey, Jim, and Johnny, they didn't have very much time for me. Looking back, I can't help but wonder if they resented me for bringing David to the home. I have to wonder if they secretly hoped that David would just take me and leave the rest of their family alone to heal. "Mommy and the boys are right here if you need anything. Call me if you need me." I nodded one more time. Pleas for him to stay danced on the tip of my tongue, but I bit them back, reasoning that if Jack said he'd be back, then he would. So I sat quietly in the chair as Jack put a movie in, started it up, and handed the remote off to me. "I'll be right back," he swore again. I watched the commercials instead of fast-forwarding through them. Eventually, Oliver and Company began to quietly play. I allowed the music and voices to fill the silence without ever actually paying any attention to it. My mind and my eyes were on Jack and my father. I was nervous that David might come back and tear them away from me. I listened, keeping a close watch on where they were. I had developed a plan. If either one of them screamed, I would grab the flask of holy water perched upon the counter in the kitchen, and I'd douse them in it, just like Brett had done with me when David had tried to steal me away. No screams came. In fact, I could hear the muffled sound of the two of them talking quietly in the kitchen. It eased my mind a little, and allowed for me to relax. I waited patiently for Jack to return, watching he and my father every time they came to the room to hang something up, or douse a wall with holy water. The two of them built a veritable fort of holy items in order to keep us safe from David. The movie was nearing the end when Jack and Dad were nearly finished. Jack wandered into the room, a wide smile that never reached his eyes spread along his cracked lips. He looked old, older than he had the night before. He looked sad. I hated David for what he'd done to my brother. Jack lifted me up and sat down upon the chair, setting me down on his lap. I leaned against him, resting my head on his chest and wrapping my arms around him. My father sat down on the floor and leaned against the couch in front of where Jim lay sleeping. Together, we sat in silence, allowing the movie to play out without ever really watching it. When the movie ended, I hopped off Jack's lap and grabbed two more. I showed them to him, and he picked his favourite of them. We continued this cycle 4 times, before strangled rays of light touched the horizon. The sun peeked over the hills and splashed the sky with brilliant colours. It greeted the world through bare trees, casting elongated shadows. They looked like long, withered fingers that blindly groped at the world around them. I might have thought it was beautiful, had my mind not been on David. My father stood, having never gotten to sleep again, just like the rest of us, save for Joey and Jim. He used the kitchen phone to make a call. I figured out, halfway through, that he was talking to Father Brown. I gathered that the father would be visiting us sometime that afternoon. I couldn't deny that I found relief in that thought. The morning was somber. No one talked. We ate in silence. We began chores in silence. In fact, the only thing to break the quiet was a deep, rattling sort of cough that plagued Jim. He insisted he was okay, just feeling under the weather, But true to form, my worrywart of a mother cornered him, armed with a thermometer. Mild concern turned to deep worry as she watched the numbers on the thermometer go up, and up, and up. When it finally beeped, it was up over 104 degrees. My mother immediately announced that she and Joey would be taking Jim to the doctor. Because my mom was gone and everyone else had to do chores, I was stuck going out to the barn. My dad firmly believed in the buddy system when David was around. Fortunately for me, Jack was with Dad, which left me with Johnny. We were tasked with feeding the pigs, which meant endless trips of buckets filled with feed. Jack had mixed the bunch up for us in the large black container and handed us scoopers in a bucket each. My body was already sore and achy from lack of sleep. My mind was cloudy, both with the events of last night and with tiredness. I'd been so frightened earlier in the day that I couldn't sleep. Now, all I wanted was to curl up on the couch where Jim had been sleeping and rest. But that wasn't an option. So I filled my bucket with the yellow and brown feed and began the long trek to the last pan. I struggled. My whole body tipped to the side as I half carried, half dragged the bucket beside me. Sweat beaded along my brow. I grunted with each heft. I tried to assure myself that I could do this, but the bucket weighed half as much as I did. My arms, weak and thin, weren't up to the task. They shook and wobbled with every step I took. Twice I had to stop and catch my breath. I was 3/4 of the way there when I heard Johnny's footfalls quicken behind me. He was rapidly gaining on me. He never slowed until he was directly to my right, walking in tandem with me. I looked over to him, curious. He could be moving so much faster than me. Why would he keep my pathetic pace? His eyes widened, and he turned toward the pigs to my left. "Hey, what's that?" he asked. I craned my neck and searched the pens, but I didn't see anything out of the ordinary. Just small, noisy piglets gathering near the bars, eager to be fed. I didn't see his foot as he slid it in front of me. I tripped, falling to the ground. The bucket hit the cement with a loud metallic clank. Feed spilled everywhere. Johnny gave a bitter snore and mumbled something about me being a loser. Pain bloomed along my knee. I pulled myself up, watching as Johnny struggled with his bucket to get it to the end of the line of pig pens. My hands clenched at my sides. Johnny had never been mean to me before last summer. I didn't understand why he changed. Or perhaps I didn't want to think about why he had. Throbbing sharp pain stung my knee. I winced as I rolled my pant leg up, careful not to brush against the tender area. My knee was scratched, blood trickled down from the 2 small cuts. It stung like a bitch, but it wasn't anything that looked too bad. I rolled my pant leg down and silently wished Johnny would trip and fall too. He didn't. But he managed to push me to the ground 3 more times before chores were complete. By the end of it all, my legs and arms were bruised, and my self-worth had suffered dramatically. When all the pigs had been fed, Johnny and I went inside, where I silently went to the sink to begin dishes. Johnny pulled a comic book out from one of the drawers in the living room and sat at the table. Every now and then, he'd look up, glare at me, then as though nothing had happened, he'd go back to reading. I did what I could to ignore him, but eventually, that was no longer an option. I couldn't reach the line of glasses at the end of the counter. I could have pulled the chair over and reached them then, but I was worried that Johnny would just push me off it. I huffed and glanced back at my older brother. "Can you help me?" I asked, trying to keep the anger out of my voice. "I can't reach the cups." I pointed upward to the line of tall, slender glasses. They were fancier than the ones David had destroyed. They'd come from a woman at the church who said that giving us her old dishware just gave her an excuse to buy new ones. She seemed excited about the prospect. My father wasn't thrilled with accepting them, but he had little choice in the matter. Johnny clenched his jaw tightly and placed the comic book down upon the table. He met my eyes, glaring straight through me. "Go eat dirt," he spat. I pursed my lips and pulled a step stool from the closet. I kept a good eye on Johnny, who never moved his place. Instead of pushing me down, he resorted to tossing angry, berating words at me. I wanted to cry by the time Jack and Dad wandered back inside. Dad went directly upstairs to clean the glass off the floor and then to shower, while Jack stayed downstairs. Jack looked like hell. Big bags rested under his eyes. He kept stretching and yawning. But all the same, he showered and returned to the kitchen clothed in something clean. He pulled the refrigerator open and returned to look at me with brilliantly green eyes. Despite being tired and probably just as scared as the rest of us, the smile on his lips never faltered. Looking back, I understand now why his eyes were puffy and red. He'd been crying. I suppose he decided sometime between the time we left the house with Father Brown's and then, they wouldn't let us see him cry anymore. "Hey sweetie," he chirped. I completely missed the sad undertone if there was one. "You hungry?" he asked, pulling piles of things out of the refrigerator. "I'm thinking of making scrambled eggs, or maybe a BLT. I haven't decided. Either one of those sound good?" I shook my head, not trusting my voice to stay level if I answered him. Despite my best efforts at acting normal, Jack saw straight through it. "What's wrong, Jazzy?" he asked, concern carved deep into his features. I broke down. I cried. I told him about how Johnny had pushed me down, how he'd mumbled under his breath every time something mean and terrible about me, how he'd spent most of our time in the kitchen hurling insults at me. Irritation swept over Jack. He placed everything back in the refrigerator and walked over to me. Right there, in the middle of the kitchen, he sat down and pulled me into his lap. His giant hands swept my curly hair away from my face, a thumb wiping away the few traitorous tears that streamed down my cheeks. It took him a long while to speak, but when he did, he offered me the best bit of advice I'd ever received. "Listen here, Jazzy Pants," he began playfully, his tired eyes sparkled with something close to mischief. "Johnny's only mean because he's jealous. He's a pansy. He cried when David went into his room. He hid under his blankets. I know, because that's where I found him, curled up in a ball, hiding under all 4 of his blankets. He didn't run. He didn't call for help like you did. He just hid and cried. He's just jealous that his little sister is braver than he is," he said with a wink. "Just remember, love, when people are mean to you, that's about them, not you. Okay?" I nodded, using my palm to wipe my eyes. Suddenly, Johnny didn't seem so big, and it didn't seem so scary. I hugged Jack, thanked him for being so nice, and scurried off to the living room, where I sat in front of the television, waiting for Jack to join me. The two of us curled up on the couch together. He had brought with him a BLT. They desperately tried to get me to try, but I refused. I had very little interest in food at the time. It didn't take long for him to give up and eat the sandwich himself. I leaned into his side, watching The Fox and the Hound until my eyelids grew too heavy, and I could no longer fight off sleep. I slipped into sweet oblivion. My eyes opened reluctantly against the burning light outside. A loud, barking, hoarse sort of noise cut through the silence, making me jump up and latch onto Jack. "Jack!" I whispered, my voice urgent and frightened. "Jack! Wake up! I think he's back!" Jack's eyes flew open again and he jumped up. At first, he looked dazed, but ready for a fight. The sound cut through the silence again, and I watched as the tension in his shoulders melted away. "It's just Jim," he assured me, before pulling me up from my place. We walked into the kitchen when my curious eyes landed on Jim, who sat at the table, coughing into his hand. A horrible, deep, rattling noise shook from deep within him. He winced away in pain and rubbed his chest. "Hey dude," Jack said, a faint smile perched upon his lips. "You sound like crap." "Thanks," Jim answered, his voice slightly annoyed. "That makes me feel all kinds of better." Jack's smile widened. "That's my job," he teased. Jim rolled his eyes and pulled his sweater tighter around himself. His thin arms wrapped around his frame, trying to conserve his heat. His cheeks were pink and his eyes were glossy. It had been a long while since I'd seen anyone this sick. In fact, I thought the last time had been when Johnny had gotten pneumonia. "What did the doctor say?" Jack asked, hiding the worry in his eyes and his voice. I was too young to pick it up at the time, but looking back, it was definitely there. "It's a viral infection," Mom answered with a sigh. "Nothing they can do as far as medicine goes. We just have to keep him on Tylenol to keep the fever at bay, and go back in 2 days if it doesn't break," she answered. Jack nodded. Probably just a cold, he decided. But all the same, he placed a hand atop Jim's head, ruffling his hair. Jim swatted his arm away. "How's the throat? Feel like you can choke down some orange juice? The vitamin C will do you good," he reminded him. Jim simply shook his head, moaned, and leaned down to rest his head on his folded arms. "Don't be such a drama queen," Johnny said from across the room. "It's not like you have pneumonia." Jack shot daggers back to Johnny. "You," he said, stabbing a finger in his direction. "You leave Jim alone. He doesn't feel well. And if I ever hear about you shoving Jazzy around like that again, I'll kick your ass. You understand me?" He barked. Johnny rolled his eyes, mumbled something that sounded a lot like "go fuck yourself" under his breath, and headed back into the living room, where he collapsed onto the couch, reading his comics. Mum and I got to work making homemade chicken and noodle soup for Jim. She prodded me throughout the process, asking me more and more about what Johnny had done. I was honest, and while she seemed annoyed, she never said anything to him. Lunch came and went. Jim picked at the soup, never actually eating anything. Instead, he stirred it and lifted some in the spoon, only to let it dribble back into the bowl. He waited, head balancing on the palm of his hand, elbow planted firmly upon the table, until everyone else was done. "Can I go lay down?" he asked, eyes on my mother. "Yeah, honey," Mum answered with a nod. "Just go to the living room." Irritation swept over his features. Anger flashed through his eyes for a split second before he wiped it away, replacing it with a pained expression. "My bed's a lot more comfortable. Can I sleep up there instead?" he asked. Dad shook his head. "Not alone, buddy." I watched as his hands curled into fists, his teeth gritted and his nostrils flared. "Then can someone come with me?" he pressed on, voice far less friendly. "Please? I'm so tired and I'm achy all over. I just want to sleep. The couch is so uncomfortable. There's no way I'll get sleep in there." Johnny leapt up from his seat, his comic books clutched in his hand. "I'll go," he said, glancing back to Mum and Dad. We all knew he just wanted to lounge around and read, but no one felt like arguing. Jim was a grump when he was sick, and Johnny had been a pain in the neck all day. My parents agreed, and if I was being honest, I was glad to be rid of the both of them. Mum and I spent the next few hours working on chores around the house. Mum functioned best if she could rely on a routine of some sort. Jack had once explained this to me. And so, I did what I could to keep her happy by going along with it. Even if I did think it was stupid that we were scrubbing baseboards, despite the fact that David had sprung up out of nowhere last night. The day bled on. Father Brown came to the house. He placed holy items in every room of the home, save for Johnny and Jim's. He gave the item to my father to place him there after he woke up. He walked around the house, sprinkling holy water on the ground as he chanted in some language I didn't understand. He had us gather and hold hands. Together, we said several prayers. Finally, we were done, and Father Brown said, with a certain level of confidence, that if David were around, he would have reacted. Soon enough, he announced that he had to go. Mom offered him dinner, but he declined, explaining that he had an appointment he had to make. He asked that we contact him if anything more happened, and offered to allow us to stay with him if need be. My parents thanked him, but my father assured him that, at least for now, we would stay where we were. My father was, and still is, a very stubborn man. A man who, as it would seem, would rather put himself in harm's way than accept kindness and charity. The days dragged on, and Jim got worse. He never came out of his room, but Johnny reported that he would lay on the bed, shiver, and moan in pain. My heart ached for him. Jack and I would routinely bring him food and juice, but he never touched any of it. He started howling in the middle of the night, screaming in agony, and writhing against the pain. Mom and Dad would get up and sit beside him. Twice, Mom took him into the ER late at night, but despite his cries of pain and the sweat that poured from him, the doctors said they couldn't find anything wrong with him. According to them, it was just a viral infection. But we didn't believe them. Things got worse and worse. His fever refused to go down for more than a few hours at once. He'd spent entire hours screaming in pain. Nothing seemed to bring him any sort of peace. It was on the third day that the fever had spiked to nearly 105. Despite having no luck with doctors prior, my mother informed us that she'd be taking him back that afternoon. She swore she wouldn't leave this time until they gave him some sort of medication. My father thought that was a good idea. She headed upstairs and we waited, but she didn't come back down. For nearly an hour she stayed up there, my father checking on her occasionally. Jim was absolutely refusing to get out of bed. He was complaining of pain, saying it would hurt to leave his bed. He complained that his skin felt like there were a million needles poking him all at once, and his head felt like it might explode from the pressure. Eventually, Mom grew tired of arguing and pulled the blankets up off him. That's when she screamed. Jack, Dad and I ran up the stairs. I'll never forget the sight of my older brother lying on a sheetless bed atop hundreds of dead bugs. Spiders, centipedes, flies and other small insects lay motionless, in piles all around him. They toppled over as he shifted. His hand smeared piles of them into the mattress as he squirmed. They broke into pieces, crumbling like dust, and leaving streaks of black behind. "What the hell is this?" my mother screamed. "What the hell are these bugs doing in your bed?" The look of horror in my mother's eyes set me on edge. She was the queen of denial, always looking for a way to explain the unexplainable, always grasping at straws when something truly terrible happened. Ever since David had returned, she'd stopped. Jim only growled in response, his lips curled up into a snarl, his back bowed and his head craned in an odd direction. He contorted and twisted. His eyes rolled back in his head. His whole body trembled. He let out a terrible growling sort of scream that shook me to my very core. "Get out!" he cried. The top of his head and his feet touched the bed, but suddenly the rest of him bowed, lifting off the mattress entirely. "Get out!" My father tore a silver cross from its place on the wall just outside of Jim's bedroom and dashed towards him. With a sizzle and a hiss, he pressed the metal against Jim's skin. Jim shrieked, thrashing in pain and swinging wildly in the air. His fist hit my father, sending him staggering across the room. Suddenly, Jim was up and out of the bed. He dashed across the room and tore past us, running down the hall and taking the stairs 3 at a time. When he reached the bottom, he turned back to stare at us. His eyes were dark, sunken, and hollow. A twisted, terrible smile was plastered upon his lips. "Run, run, run," he hissed from the bottom of the stairs. "Better catch me, catch me, catch me, catch me." With that, he sprinted into the kitchen, where we'd left Joey in his pack and play. A bitter, angry laugh trickled from his lips as Jack and my father raced down the hall. Above the stomping of their feet against the stairs as they chased after Jim, I heard the wail of my brother and a half-growled shout. "Hush, little baby!" "Jim! You put him down!" Jack roared as he turned the corner. "Don't you dare hurt him! You put him down!" I'd never heard my brother so angry. Tears streamed down my face, and I looked around, desperate for someone to turn to for comfort. There was no one. I was alone.